Hi everyone, welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. This is the story of Elizabeth Thomas, a 15-year-old who was abducted by her high school teacher, Tad Cummins, and went missing for 38 harrowing days before being rescued. Elizabeth Thomas was no different from countless teenagers her age, 15, full of life's potential, navigating the highs and lows of adolescence. In her hometown of Columbia, Tennessee, life was simple. Days were marked by the familiar rhythm of school, family dinners, and moments spent with her siblings. She was the kind of girl you'd notice for her quiet determination. Those who knew her described her as sweet, introspective, and caring, someone who often put others' needs ahead of her own. But Elizabeth's life wasn't without its hardships. Behind her composed exterior lay a young girl bearing far more than her fair share of burdens. Her family life had its struggles, as her home was marked by financial strain and personal challenges. These struggles left Elizabeth searching for stability, for someone to confide in, for a sense of validation and belonging. This vulnerability, the kind that many teenagers feel, made her an easy target. And unfortunately, that target was noticed by someone whose intentions were anything but protective. Tad Cummins wasn't just her high school teacher, he was a figure of authority, a role model, or at least, he was supposed to be. As her science teacher, Tad had direct access to Elizabeth on a daily basis. He was 50 years old enough to be her grandfather, and had built a career around earning the trust of students and parents alike. Outwardly, he seemed the picture of professionalism, a steady, dependable teacher with decades of experience. But Tad Cummins was far from the man he appeared to be. Over time, Tad began to single Elizabeth out, creating an environment where she felt safe confiding in him. To Elizabeth, it must have seemed like he truly cared, listening to her struggles, offering advice, and positioning himself as someone she could trust when everything else felt uncertain. What Elizabeth likely didn't realize was that this wasn't the concern of a mentor or a teacher. This was manipulation. Tad wasn't looking to guide her or help her, he was laying the groundwork for something far more dangerous. The term for what Tad was doing is grooming, a deliberate, calculated process used by predators to gain trust and establish control over their victims. It's a slow, methodical erosion of boundaries. It starts innocently enough: extra attention, special treatment, an understanding ear. But it escalates, bit by bit, until the lines between right and wrong blur. For Elizabeth, the attention may have felt reassuring, comforting even. She was, after all, a young girl searching for guidance. But for Tad, every interaction was part of a larger plan. Tad's grooming tactics became increasingly bold. He began isolating Elizabeth from her peers, ensuring she relied on him more and more. Little gestures, a kind word here, a subtle compliment there, were designed to make her feel valued, even special. To a teenager already grappling with self-doubt, this attention could easily feel like validation. Tad exploited that. And as the weeks turned into months, the trust he cultivated turned into control. By the time anyone began to notice that Tad's behavior toward Elizabeth was crossing professional boundaries, the damage had already been done. Witnesses later reported seeing Tad interact with Elizabeth in ways that felt overly familiar, too personal for a teacher-student relationship. Whispers spread through the school, concerns were raised, but the warnings came too late. The lines had already been crossed. What makes grooming so insidious is that it's often invisible to the victim until it's too late. The manipulation is so gradual, so subtle, that by the time the victim realizes something is wrong, they're trapped, bound by fear, confusion, and the belief that they might somehow be at fault. For Elizabeth, this must have been a time of profound emotional turmoil. On one hand, she was a teenager just trying to figure out her place in the world. On the other, she was being pulled into a situation far beyond her ability to comprehend or control. As Tad's influence over Elizabeth grew, so did his confidence. He must have known the risks, the consequences of his actions, and yet, he pressed forward. By March 13, 2017, the lives of Elizabeth Thomas and Tad Cummins were hurtling toward a critical turning point. The calculated manipulation of Tad Cummins had reached its peak, and what began as subtle exploitation had grown into something far more sinister. That morning, Elizabeth woke up as she always did, likely unaware of the full gravity of what was about to unfold. For months, Tad had methodically chipped away at her sense of self, her perception of boundaries, and her ability to resist his control. He had spent weeks convincing her that leaving was not just an option, it was their destiny. She was 15, vulnerable, and under the spell of a man she believed she could trust. It was on that Monday morning that Tad executed his plan, taking Elizabeth with him as though the two were embarking on some forbidden journey. Surveillance footage later captured them leaving Kulioka Unit School together, a chilling moment that would mark the beginning of Elizabeth's 38-day ordeal. To anyone witnessing the two walk away, there was likely little reason to suspect the horrifying reality of the situation. But from that moment on, Elizabeth's world was torn away from her, and she became the focus of one of the most gripping cases of abduction in recent history. When Elizabeth didn't show up for class and didn't return home, alarm bells rang almost immediately. For her family, the realization that Elizabeth was missing was like a punch to the gut. Her siblings, who adored her, were left reeling, unable to comprehend how she could simply vanish. Elizabeth's mother was overcome with panic, her mind racing through countless questions. Had she run away? Was she in danger? The uncertainties became unbearable as every passing hour solidified one haunting truth: Elizabeth was gone. When Tad Cummins was identified as missing alongside Elizabeth, the situation escalated rapidly. This wasn't a typical missing persons case, it was an abduction, and Tad Cummins was the predator. Investigators pieced together the early details. Tad had convinced Elizabeth to leave with him, exploiting her trust to serve his selfish motives. The initial hours of the search were frantic, fueled by the hope that they might intercept the two before they disappeared entirely. But Tad had prepared for this moment meticulously. He had taken steps to evade detection, disconnecting himself from technology and choosing remote locations to stay hidden. He knew the risks, yet believed he could outsmart law enforcement. The disappearance of Elizabeth Thomas sent shockwaves through the community and the nation. A 15-year-old girl abducted by her teacher, it was the kind of case that felt almost incomprehensible, and the news spread like wildfire. Within a day, an Amber Alert was issued, broadcasting Elizabeth's name, face, and description across the country. The urgency of the alert underscored the gravity of the situation. Law enforcement agencies rallied together, leveraging every tool and resource to locate Elizabeth before it was too late. The Amber Alert carried Elizabeth's story far and wide, and her face became impossible to ignore. People across the country saw her smiling photo, a haunting reminder of the innocence lost in that moment of abduction. While investigators sifted through evidence and followed leads, the public became an essential part of the search. Tips flooded in, some credible and others less so, but each one carried a shred of hope that Elizabeth might be found. Her name became a rallying cry for those desperate to see justice served. For Elizabeth's family, the weight was unbearable. Her mother clung to hope with an intensity only a parent can understand, praying for Elizabeth's safe return even as fear gnawed at her. Her siblings struggled to go about their daily lives, unable to escape the constant ache of her absence. Friends and neighbors rallied around the family, offering support, prayers, and comfort. The entire community was united by a singular hope: to bring Elizabeth home. Despite the widespread attention and relentless efforts of law enforcement, the search for Elizabeth proved agonizingly difficult. Tad Cummins had planned their escape down to the smallest detail, ensuring they would remain hidden. He had disabled his phone's GPS, used cache to avoid leaving a trail, and deliberately chosen remote locations where they could evade capture. For investigators, these tactics presented significant challenges, and the case seemed to stall as days turned into weeks. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was trapped, cut off from her family and everything familiar. At just 15 years old, she was navigating a reality far beyond her capacity to understand or escape. Tad had stripped away her autonomy, her freedom, and her sense of safety. For Elizabeth, every moment must have been marked by fear, confusion, and an overwhelming longing for the life she had been robbed of. She was a victim, but she was also resilient, surviving an ordeal that would test even the strongest of individuals. While Elizabeth endured her captivity, the nation refused to give up on her. Law enforcement agencies remained steadfast, pursuing every lead and tip with determination. The search for Elizabeth was relentless, driven by the unwavering hope that she could be found before it was too late. The emotional weight of those weeks hung heavy over everyone involved, but the resolve to bring her home never wavered. The search began locally, with authorities scouring Columbia, Tennessee, for any clues that might lead to the missing pair. Investigators combed through surveillance footage, questioned witnesses, and retraced the steps of both Elizabeth and Tad Cummins in the days leading up to their disappearance. Early on, they discovered that Tad had rented a silver Nissan Rogue just prior to their flight, a crucial piece of information that would later play a significant role in tracking them down. The search quickly expanded beyond Tennessee. It became evident that Tad, who had planned the abduction meticulously, was moving fast and intentionally staying off the radar. With no active cell phone signal to trace and no digital footprints, investigators had little to go on but the occasional tip from the public. Tad had ditched his credit and debit cards, relying solely on cash transactions to avoid detection. Every decision he made was calculated, aimed at staying one step ahead of the law. As the days stretched into weeks, leads began to trickle in, some promising, others dead ends. People from all walks of life reported possible sightings of the pair. A couple claimed to have seen them at a Walmart in Oklahoma, another tip placed them in a diner in Arkansas. Yet, each time authorities arrived to investigate, the trail had gone cold. The frustration was palpable. Despite their best efforts, Tad and Elizabeth seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving behind nothing but fleeting shadows. The psychological strain of the search weighed heavily on everyone involved. For Elizabeth's family, the weight was unbearable. Her mother clung to hope, even as fear threatened to consume her. She stayed up late into the night, staring at the phone, willing it to ring with news of her daughter's whereabouts. Her siblings, too young to fully grasp the complexities of what was happening, wrestled with an absence they couldn't understand. For them, life without Elizabeth felt like a puzzle with a missing piece. No matter what they did, it was incomplete. For the investigators, it was a race against time. They worked around the clock, fueled by an unwavering determination to bring Elizabeth home. But their task was anything but simple. Tad Cummins had created layers of obfuscation, moving through rural towns and remote areas where their presence wouldn't arouse suspicion. His calculated nature, combined with the randomness of their movements, made it nearly impossible to predict his next move. Complicating matters further was the reality of public tips. While the Amber Alert proved instrumental in spreading awareness, it also generated an overwhelming volume of information, much of it false or irrelevant. Every tip had to be evaluated, cross-referenced, and prioritized, a painstaking process that consumed precious time and resources. Investigators knew that every minute spent chasing a false lead was a minute lost in the search for Elizabeth. Yet, even in the face of these challenges, the resolve to find Elizabeth never wavered. Task forces were formed, collaborating across state lines to pool resources and expertise. They enlisted the help of forensic analysts, behavioral psychologists, and technology specialists, all working toward the same goal. The search became a coordinated effort, a testament to the power of unity in the face of adversity. Amid the frustrations and setbacks, small victories kept hope alive. Investigators were eventually able to piece together a partial timeline of Tad and Elizabeth's movements, thanks to surveillance footage from gas stations and small businesses. They identified patterns in Tad's behavior, his tendency to avoid crowded areas, his preference for back roads over highways, and used these insights to narrow their search. But the real turning point came when the tip from a property caretaker in Northern California reached law enforcement. It finally offered the lead investigators had been hoping for, a glimmer of hope in what had often felt like an impossible search. The caretaker reported seeing a suspicious vehicle, a silver Nissan Rogue, parked near an isolated cabin deep in the wilderness. The location was remote, far from main roads and hidden from prying eyes, a place chosen with precision by Tad Cummins to ensure they wouldn't be found. Law enforcement acted quickly. The tip aligned with previous findings regarding Tad's movements and fit the profile of someone attempting to stay out of sight. Investigators moved in carefully, wary of what they might encounter. The cabin was surrounded by dense forest, its solitude emphasized by the sounds of rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. It was a place meant to be forgotten, a place where Tad believed he could evade the consequences of his actions. Inside the cabin, the scene was bleak. Elizabeth had spent over a month in this space, held captive not only physically but emotionally and psychologically. The conditions were sparse, no modern comforts, no connection to the outside world. The isolation was suffocating, a tool Tad used to maintain control over her. For Elizabeth, every day must have felt like an eternity, her young mind grappling with the overwhelming fear and confusion of being held in such an environment. She was cut off from everything familiar, and the cabin's walls must have felt like they were closing in on her with each passing moment. When authorities arrived, the tension was palpable. Tad Cummins, sensing the inevitability of his capture, didn't resist. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was finally freed. For her, the rescue was both a relief and a shock, a moment she likely longed for but couldn't fully process after weeks of captivity. As she stepped out of the cabin and into the arms of the investigators who had fought tirelessly to find her, the weight of her ordeal must have been overwhelming. The reunion with her family was profoundly emotional. Elizabeth's mother had spent over a month clinging to the hope that her daughter would come home. When that hope became reality, the flood of relief, love, and gratitude was indescribable. Elizabeth's siblings, who had missed her desperately, finally had their sister back, a moment that would forever be etched in their memories. For Elizabeth, returning home marked the beginning of a new chapter, a journey of healing and rediscovering herself after the trauma she had endured. The rescue was not the end of her story, but a turning point. It was a moment of liberation, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the unwavering determination of those who fought to bring her back. After Elizabeth Thomas's rescue, the focus of the story shifted. The public outcry that had initially driven the nationwide search now turned toward demands for accountability, specifically, justice for what Tad Cummins had done. Authorities wasted no time in taking Cummins into custody, ensuring he would face the legal consequences of his actions. The process that followed was both methodical and resolute, mirroring the determination that had brought Elizabeth home. Once in custody, Tad Cummins was charged with multiple serious offenses, including federal charges of kidnapping and transportation of a minor across state lines for the purpose of sexual activity. These charges carried heavy penalties, and for good reason. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Prosecutors worked to piece together every detail of Cummins' actions, from the grooming process to the calculated abduction and 38-day captivity. Witness testimonies, surveillance footage, and Tad's own admissions painted a damning picture of his deliberate and manipulative behavior. In court, Cummins pleaded guilty to the charges brought against him, perhaps understanding the inevitability of his conviction given the weight of the evidence. His sentencing marked a defining moment in the case. In 2019, Tad Cummins was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, followed by a lifetime of supervised release. The sentence was a reflection not only of the crime itself but also of the profound betrayal of trust involved. As a teacher, Cummins had wielded authority over Elizabeth, an authority he had grossly abused for his own selfish and harmful purposes. The court made it clear that such actions were intolerable, and the sentence served as a warning to others who might exploit positions of trust and power. For Elizabeth's family, the sentencing was both a relief and a painful reminder of what had been taken from them. Justice, while important, could never undo the trauma Elizabeth endured. Yet it brought a sense of closure, an acknowledgement that Cummins would never have the chance to hurt another young person in the same way. The aftermath of the ordeal was a challenging and deeply personal journey for Elizabeth Thomas. Being abducted, manipulated, and held captive for 38 days had left lasting scars, both emotional and psychological. Returning home was not as simple as stepping through the door. It marked the beginning of a long path toward healing and reclaiming her life. In the early days following her rescue, Elizabeth withdrew from public attention. Her family, determined to protect her privacy, offered her the space she needed to process everything she had experienced. Counseling and therapy became essential parts of her recovery, helping her navigate the complex emotions tied to the trauma. She had to confront not only the actions of Tad Cummins but also the ways his manipulation had distorted her sense of trust and safety. Elizabeth's journey was not without its difficulties. Trauma has a way of lingering, seeping into moments when least expected. Yet through it all, she demonstrated resilience, a determination to move forward and rebuild. With the support of her family and professional resources, Elizabeth began finding ways to rediscover her identity outside of the shadow of the abduction. While the experience would always be a part of her story, she refused to let it define her entirely. The case of Elizabeth Thomas and Tad Cummins highlighted significant gaps in safeguards for students and vulnerabilities in the systems meant to protect them. Cummins' actions, his grooming, manipulation, and eventual abduction, revealed how easily trust could be abused when proper oversight was absent. As a result, the case spurred conversations about tightening protections for young people in educational settings. Following the case, schools and policymakers across the country began re-evaluating their protocols for addressing inappropriate behavior by educators. This included implementing stricter guidelines for reporting concerns, providing training for staff on recognizing grooming behaviors, and emphasizing the importance of creating environments where students felt safe speaking up. The case also drew attention to the need for more robust background checks and monitoring mechanisms to prevent individuals with predatory tendencies from entering positions of trust. For advocacy groups, Elizabeth's story became a rallying point. Organizations dedicated to protecting children from abuse used her case as an example of the urgent need for reforms. Efforts to educate parents and communities about the signs of grooming gained momentum, aiming to prevent similar cases from occurring in the future. While no policy change could erase the pain Elizabeth endured, the ripple effects of her case ensured that her experience was not in vain. Her resilience and courage became a source of inspiration, and her story served as a powerful reminder of the importance of vigilance, empathy, and accountability. As we conclude on this story, we are left with much to reflect on: a young girl, torn from her family, thrust into unimaginable circumstances, and ultimately rescued. Elizabeth's story is not just a tale of tragedy, it is a testament to resilience, courage, and the human spirit's ability to endure even the darkest of trials. Elizabeth's bravery throughout her ordeal is a source of inspiration. At 15, she faced a situation that would have overwhelmed even the strongest of individuals, yet she emerged from it and began the difficult process of healing. Her resilience reminds us that, even in moments of despair, there is hope. Her story demonstrates the importance of supporting victims of abuse and providing them with the tools and resources they need to recover. This case also highlights the critical need for awareness about grooming and abduction, issues that are often invisible until it is too late. Grooming is insidious, a quiet violation of trust that preys on vulnerabilities and erodes boundaries. Tad Cummins' actions were not just those of a predator, they were a stark reminder that those in positions of authority must be held to the highest standards of accountability. Elizabeth's story calls on all of us, parents, educators, and communities, to remain vigilant, to listen, and to act when something feels wrong. Organizations that work to protect young people and support victims of abuse play a vital role in addressing these issues. Their efforts provide education, advocacy, and resources for those who need them most. Supporting these organizations is one way we can contribute to a safer world, where stories like Elizabeth's become less common. Whether through donations, volunteer work, or simply spreading awareness, each of us has the power to make a difference. As we look forward, let Elizabeth's story remind us of the importance of empathy and vigilance. It's a reminder to pay attention to the struggles of those around us, to the signs of exploitation, and to the moments when intervention could make all the difference. Elizabeth Thomas endured an experience that no one should ever have to face. Yet her resilience and the efforts of those who refused to give up on her ensured that her story became one of survival, justice, and, ultimately, hope. It's a story that calls us to action and reminds us of the power of unity. To those listening, let this be a moment of reflection. Perhaps there's someone in your life who could benefit from your attention, your support, or your kindness. Perhaps there's a cause you feel moved to join. The ripple effects of small actions can be profound. Let us carry forward the lessons learned from Elizabeth's story, with care, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to creating a world where every child can grow up safe, supported, and free from harm. If you found this story captivating and you're still awake, consider subscribing to this channel. I share more carefully crafted true crime stories designed to engage your mind and provide a calming escape as you ease into sleep. Thank you for your support, it means so much to me, and I'm honored to have you as part of this growing community of thoughtful listeners. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 2. The true story of the toxic town, inside the real-life poisoning case that affected dozens of babies, and why it's considered the British Erin Brockovich. Corby's story begins with transformation, and it wasn't just the town that changed, it was the lives of the people who moved there, seeking promise and opportunity. In the early 20th century, Corby was an unassuming village, quiet and peaceful, nestled in Northamptonshire. It was a place where life was simple, where families carried on with traditions that had lasted for generations. But by the 1930s, that simplicity was replaced by the rumble of machinery, the rising smoke of chimneys, and the hurried footsteps of workers in their steel-toed boots. Corby was about to undergo a metamorphosis, driven by Britain's booming steel industry. With its location perfect for both resources and transport, Corby quickly became the focal point for steel production. The promise of secure jobs and economic growth drew thousands to its gates, and what was once a quiet village became an industrial hub, brimming with activity and optimism. Families uprooted their lives and moved to Corby, drawn by the promise of progress. New streets sprang up where there had once been fields, houses were built to accommodate the influx of workers, and schools were established for the growing number of children. This wasn't just the birth of a steelworks, it was the birth of a new community, one that revolved around the industry that had given it life. The steelworks weren't just massive machines that churned out products. They were the heart of the town, the reason behind its rhythm, and the pride of its people. Generations grew up in the shadow of the steel industry, with parents proudly donning their uniforms and heading off to work each morning. The industry wasn't just a source of income, it was woven into the identity of Corby itself. It gave the town purpose, and it gave its people hope. For decades, the town thrived. The steelworks became synonymous with Corby, and the community flourished alongside it. The lives of the workers were not easy. Steel production demanded grit, strength, and long hours, but the reward was worth it. This was the life they knew, the life they had built. And Corby had never been stronger. But strength isn't always permanent. By the 1970s, the steel industry began to falter. Corby, once proud and steadfast, found itself facing an uncertain future. Global markets were shifting, competition was rising, and Britain's industrial dominance was slipping away. The steelworks, once unstoppable, slowed to a crawl. Production was no longer booming, it was dwindling. The conversations among workers shifted from optimism to worry, as rumors of closure began to circulate. The rumors became reality in the 1980s. The steelworks shut down, and with it, Corby lost not only its primary source of employment but also its very identity. Thousands of workers were left jobless, and the once thriving town faced an economic crisis. The chimneys that had once stood as symbols of industry and progress now stood silent, ghosts of an era that had come to an abrupt end. For the people of Corby, the closure was devastating. Families who had moved to the town for its promise now found themselves asking hard questions about their future. The community, built on steel and shaped by its rhythms, was now faced with the daunting task of rebuilding itself from the ground up. But the loss of the steelworks was just the beginning. As the steel industry faded into history, the legacy it left behind began to surface, and it wasn't the legacy anyone wanted. The land that had housed the factories and machinery was contaminated with toxic waste, the byproducts of years of steel production. For decades, this waste had been carelessly buried, its dangers hidden from sight. When the factories closed, so too did the oversight of what lay beneath the ground. The waste remained, silent and unnoticed, until it began to affect those who lived above it. Years passed, and Corby pressed forward. The factories were dismantled, and the land repurposed for new uses. But the consequences of the steel industry's negligence were not erased. The improper disposal of toxic waste created invisible scars on the land, and eventually, those scars began to show themselves in the lives of the town's residents. Families began to notice a pattern. Children born in Corby were developing unusual birth defects, limb abnormalities that seemed inexplicable. Mothers searched for answers, but none were immediately forthcoming. What could be causing this? Could it be chance, or was something deeper at play? The questions weighed heavy, and the search for truth began. This search would lead to revelations that shook the community to its core. The toxic waste left behind by the steelworks had seeped into the environment, contaminating the land and causing harm to the very people who had trusted in the promise of industry. The careless decisions made during Corby's industrial heyday were now casting a long shadow over the town's future. And the families affected by these decisions would not stay silent. For years, Corby worked to heal its wounds from the economic collapse caused by the steelworks closure. The factories were demolished, the land was cleared, and new developments were brought in to give the town a fresh start. Outwardly, Corby seemed to be moving forward. Families carried on, children played in the parks, and for many, it felt as though the worst had passed. But beneath the surface of this seemingly bright future, another story was quietly taking shape, one that no one could have anticipated. It began with mothers, observant, determined, and unrelenting in their love for their children. These women were not connected to one another at first. Their lives were ordinary, filled with the daily tasks of caring for their families. But they all began to notice something troubling, something that left them with questions they couldn't ignore. Babies were being born with unusual limb deformities. Arms and legs that hadn't formed as they should. In some cases, fingers and toes were missing entirely. These were not isolated incidents. Over time, the number of affected children grew, and with it, a growing sense of unease. The mothers were confused and frightened. Why were their children born this way? Was it something they had done during pregnancy? Was it a genetic issue? Or was there something in their environment that they didn't yet understand? Doctors offered few answers, often dismissing the cases as rare but natural occurrences. But as more and more children were born with similar deformities, the pattern became impossible to ignore. These were not coincidences. Something was wrong. Take, for instance, the case of Joanne, one of the first mothers to step forward. Her son, born in the late 1980s, had a severely shortened arm, with no hand at the end. Joanne was heartbroken and confused. Throughout her pregnancy, she had done everything by the book, eating well, avoiding harmful substances, attending all her prenatal appointments. There was no explanation for what had happened, and the lack of answers only deepened her distress. Then there was Sarah, another mother whose daughter was born with significant limb abnormalities. Sarah's daughter had underdeveloped fingers on one hand and a leg that required multiple surgeries just to support her weight. Like Joanne, Sarah had no history of genetic conditions in her family, and her doctors were unable to explain her daughter's condition. Over time, Sarah began to hear about other mothers in Corby whose children had similar issues. It was through these stories that Sarah began to see the pattern emerging. These mothers started to connect the dots. They shared their experiences, their heartbreak, and their suspicions. They began to wonder if something in Corby's environment might be responsible. After all, the town had a long history with heavy industry, and many of the areas where children played and families lived had been built on or near former industrial sites. Could something left behind by the steelworks be to blame? The questions kept mounting, and with them came a determination to find answers. The mothers began to speak up, sharing their stories with the wider community. As more and more cases came to light, what had once seemed like an isolated issue started to look like a much larger problem. It was around this time that a journalist named Michael Henderson took notice. Michael had been following environmental issues in industrial towns for years, and when he first heard about the birth defects in Corby, he knew there was more to the story. Michael wasn't content to accept the official line that these cases were simply coincidences. He dug deeper, asking questions, poring over historical records, and speaking to anyone who might have insight into what was happening. What Michael discovered was startling. During the demolition of Corby's steelworks in the 1980s, vast amounts of toxic waste had been unearthed and transported across town without proper safety measures. Soil contaminated with hazardous chemicals was moved through residential areas, often uncovered and exposed to the elements. These toxic materials weren't just sitting in forgotten corners of the town, they were being scattered into the air, the water, and the very land where people lived and children played. Michael's investigation revealed that this contamination coincided with the years when many of the affected children were conceived and born. It was a revelation that sent shockwaves through the community. For the mothers, it confirmed what they had long suspected: the town's industrial past was not just a part of history, it was still affecting their lives in ways they couldn't have imagined. Armed with this information, the mothers knew they couldn't stay silent. They began to organize, determined to hold those responsible for the contamination accountable. What followed was the start of a legal and moral battle that would last for years. But for these mothers, it was more than a fight for justice, it was a fight for their children, for their families, and for the truth. When the mothers of Corby banded together, they weren't just fighting for their children, they were fighting against the odds. They were ordinary women, many of them juggling the demands of family life, work, and personal struggles. None of them had experience taking on powerful institutions, but that didn't matter. Their love for their children and their frustration at the lack of accountability fueled their resolve. They refused to accept the explanations, or lack thereof, that they had been given. These were not isolated incidents. This was a pattern, and they were determined to prove it. Coming together was no easy feat. Each mother had her own story, her own pain, and her own doubts about whether they would ever find answers. But as they shared their experiences, they began to see the strength in their unity. It wasn't just their children's futures they were fighting for, it was the future of all the families in Corby and the principle that no community should ever have to endure such negligence. Their efforts began with raising awareness. They spoke to neighbors, attended community meetings, and reached out to anyone who would listen. Their message was simple: something had gone terribly wrong, and it was time for those responsible to be held accountable. Slowly but surely, their voices gained traction. Local newspapers picked up their stories, sparking conversations about Corby's industrial past and its potential consequences. But awareness alone wasn't enough. The mothers knew that if they were going to make a difference, they needed to take their fight to the courts. Enter Des Collins, a civil litigator with a passion for environmental justice. When Des was approached by the mothers of Corby, he was immediately struck by the gravity of their situation. He understood the enormity of what they were up against, not just the legal complexities, but the emotional toll of fighting for justice in the face of skepticism and resistance. But Des also saw something else: the unwavering determination of these women to protect their children and demand accountability. Taking on the case was a monumental task. The legal battle would span over a decade, requiring exhaustive research, expert testimony, and unrelenting advocacy. Des and his team worked tirelessly to build their case, combing through historical records, environmental reports, and medical studies to uncover the truth. They argued that the toxic waste left behind by the steelworks had been mishandled during demolition, leading to contamination that affected the health of unborn children. It was a complex case, requiring them to prove not just the presence of contamination, but a direct link between the toxic waste and the birth defects. The opposition was fierce. Defendants in the case, including Corby Borough Council, denied any wrongdoing, arguing that there was no evidence to support the claims. They pointed to the challenges of proving causation in environmental cases, hoping to discredit the mother's allegations. But Des and his team refused to back down. They presented compelling evidence, including expert testimony from environmental scientists and medical professionals, that supported the mother's claims. They highlighted the timing of the demolition and the pattern of birth defects, painting a clear picture of negligence and its consequences. Throughout the legal battle, the mothers remained steadfast. They attended hearings, spoke to the media, and supported one another through the ups and downs of the case. Their courage was remarkable, not just in the courtroom, but in their ability to persist despite the emotional weight of their fight. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for accountability, for justice, and for the hope that no other community would have to endure what they had. In 2009, after years of legal wrangling, the High Court issued a landmark ruling. The court found that Corby Borough Council had been negligent in its handling of toxic waste during the demolition of the steelworks. The ruling linked the contamination to the birth defects experienced by the children, validating the mother's claims and providing a measure of justice for the affected families. For the mothers of Corby, the ruling was both a victory and a bittersweet moment. It couldn't undo the harm that had been done, nor could it erase the years of struggle and uncertainty they had faced. But it was a powerful acknowledgement of their fight and a step toward accountability. The ruling set a precedent for environmental justice in Britain, highlighting the importance of protecting communities from industrial negligence. The case also had broader implications. It drew attention to the dangers of toxic waste and the need for stringent regulations to prevent similar disasters in the future. It reminded policymakers, corporations, and communities alike that the cost of negligence is far too high to ignore. For the mothers, the fight was never just about winning a legal battle, it was about standing up for what was right. And while their journey had been long and arduous, they had proven that even the smallest voices can make a difference when they come together. The landmark ruling in 2009 was more than just a victory for the mothers of Corby, it was a turning point for environmental justice in Britain. For decades, industrial negligence had been allowed to slip through the cracks of accountability. Communities like Corby, small and reliant on industry, often faced the brunt of the fallout, while corporations and councils sidestepped their responsibilities. This case changed that narrative. It proved that ordinary people, armed with determination and truth, could challenge the systems that had failed them and emerge victorious. The implications of the ruling rippled far beyond Corby. It set a powerful precedent, sending a clear message that the health and safety of communities could not be sacrificed in the name of economic convenience. The case highlighted the importance of proper environmental regulations and oversight, reminding policymakers and corporations alike that negligence is not only morally reprehensible but also legally punishable. The fight led by the mothers of Corby showed that no community was too small to demand justice. It reminded the world that the actions, or inactions, of those in power have consequences, and that these consequences are often borne by the most vulnerable among us. It wasn't just a win for Corby, it was a win for environmental justice everywhere. As the case gained prominence, comparisons to Erin Brockovich's fight in the United States became inevitable. Both stories were rooted in the devastating impact of industrial contamination on unsuspecting communities. Both cases involved a determined group of individuals, ordinary citizens who refused to accept the status quo and demanded accountability. And both were defined by the resilience and courage of those who fought for justice. Erin Brockovich's case in Hinckley, California, centered on groundwater contamination caused by Pacific Gas and Electric Company's improper disposal of hexavalent chromium. Like Corby, the affected community faced health problems that were initially dismissed or ignored. But Aaron's relentless advocacy brought the truth to light, leading to one of the largest settlements in U.S. history and sparking broader conversations about corporate responsibility. The mothers of Corby shared Aaron's tenacity, and their legal battle echoed the themes of persistence and courage that defined her fight. Both cases served as wake-up calls, highlighting the hidden costs of industrial progress and the need for accountability. They proved that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged, and that justice, though often hard-won, was possible. Yet while the comparisons are striking, the Corby case stands on its own as a uniquely British story. It underscored the environmental challenges faced by post-industrial towns and the resilience of communities working to rebuild after economic decline. It reminded Britain, and the world, that environmental justice is not just a matter of policy, it's a matter of humanity. The victory in court was, for many families, a bittersweet moment. The ruling validated years of struggle and gave them a sense of closure, but it could not undo the harm that had been done. For the mothers of Corby, the fight was never just about winning a legal case, it was about protecting their children, their families, and their community. Joanne, whose son was born with a severely shortened arm, reflected on the journey. "You do what you have to do for your child," she said. "There were times when it felt like we'd never get answers, like no one was listening. But we couldn't give up. We owed it to our children to keep fighting." Sarah, whose daughter had underdeveloped fingers and required surgeries on her leg, spoke of the emotional toll. "It was exhausting," she admitted. "There were moments when I wondered if it was all worth it. But then I'd look at my daughter and remember why we were doing this. It wasn't just for her, it was for every child in Corby who deserves a better future." For Des Collins, the civil litigator who led the case, the ruling was a testament to the power of perseverance. "These families showed incredible strength," he said. "They took on a fight that many thought was impossible, and they won. Their courage is an example for all of us." The case also brought the community closer together. Families who had once felt isolated in their struggles found solidarity and support in one another. Corby's story became not just a tale of environmental justice but also a testament to the resilience of its people. It was a reminder that even in the face of adversity, there is strength in unity. As the story of Corby's toxic legacy comes to a close, one truth becomes unmistakably clear: this is not just a story about a small town in Northamptonshire. It's a story about resilience, about the power of ordinary people standing up against extraordinary injustice. It's a story that reminds us of the hidden costs of industrial progress, costs that are often paid by the most vulnerable among us, while those responsible escape accountability for far too long. The case of Corby is more than an environmental disaster, it's a cautionary tale about the consequences of negligence. It serves as a stark reminder that the decisions we make today, whether to prioritize profits or take shortcuts in safety, can leave an indelible mark on the future. For Corby, the scars of its industrial past were carried not just by the land, but by its children, by families who trusted in the promise of progress, only to find themselves betrayed by poor oversight and careless handling of toxic waste. This fight was never easy, and it required strength that many didn't know they possessed. The mothers of Corby were not lawyers, politicians, or experts, they were ordinary women who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. They were united by their shared pain and driven by an unwavering love for their children. And despite every obstacle, despite years of being dismissed and doubted, they fought, and they won. The landmark ruling in 2009 didn't just bring justice for the families of Corby. It set a precedent for environmental accountability, forcing corporations and councils to face the reality of their actions. It showed the world that no community is too small to demand change, and that those in power can and must be held accountable for the harm they cause. But this victory, while significant, is bittersweet. It cannot undo the harm that was done, nor can it fully heal the wounds inflicted on Corby's families. The children who were born with deformities will carry the legacy of this negligence for the rest of their lives. Their families will always wonder what might have been, had the toxic waste been handled properly. And Corby itself will forever be marked by this dark chapter in its history. Still, this is a story of hope, a hope that the lessons learned from Corby's fight will inspire change in other communities. It's a reminder that even in the face of adversity, unity and determination can bring about real progress. And it's a call to each of us to protect our communities, to demand accountability, and to ensure that no family, no child, and no town is left to bear the consequences of industrial negligence ever again. The story of Corby is one that must be remembered. It's a story that deserves to be shared, not just for the families who lived it, but for every community facing similar struggles. As you watch this video, take a moment to reflect on what this case means for all of us. What lessons can we learn from Corby's fight? How can we ensure that history doesn't repeat itself? Whether you're in a small town or a bustling city, whether your community has faced similar challenges or is untouched by industrial contamination, this story matters. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in protecting the world we live in. And if you've been inspired by Corby's fight, don't let that inspiration fade. Take action in your own community. Advocate for stronger environmental regulations. Hold corporations and councils accountable. Speak up when you see injustice. Because the story of Corby is not just a story, it's a call to action. And it's up to all of us to answer that call. Story 3. This is the story of Kitty Genovese, revisiting her tragic murder 61 years later and how it led to the creation of the 911 system. Kitty wasn't just a victim or a name in a tragic headline, she was a vibrant individual, full of life, with dreams and ambitions. Born Catherine Susan Genovese in Brooklyn in 1935, she grew up in a middle-class Italian-American family. Her early life was shaped by close family ties and the traditions of her immigrant upbringing. Kitty's friends described her as outgoing and kind-hearted, someone who had an infectious laugh and a magnetic personality. She loved people, loved her life in New York, and loved her job as a bar manager, a role that perfectly suited her charisma and interpersonal skills. At the age of 28, Kitty lived independently in Kew Gardens, Queens. Her apartment was modest but cozy, a reflection of the hard-working life she had built for herself. She was determined, self-reliant, and deeply connected to her friends and partner. Kitty's routine revolved around her work, social circle, and her quiet moments in her neighborhood, a place she believed to be safe, familiar, and welcoming. To understand Kitty's story, we must also understand the city she lived in. New York City in the 1960s was a city of stark contrasts, a hub of opportunity and innovation, yet a place that struggled with crime, social unrest, and the complexities of urban life. While Manhattan hummed with life and ambition, neighborhoods like Queens maintained a quieter, almost suburban atmosphere. People kept to themselves, and the sense of community often came with an unspoken rule: mind your own business. This cultural dynamic would later play a haunting role in Kitty's fate. The early 1960s were also a time of social transformation in America. The civil rights movement was in full swing, challenging deeply rooted prejudices and inequalities. Women like Kitty were breaking stereotypes and carving out independent lives, yet they also faced societal hurdles in a world that wasn't entirely ready to embrace change. Crime was becoming a growing concern in urban areas, with police forces and emergency systems often unprepared to handle the increasing demands. It was within this backdrop that Kitty's life unfolded, full of potential but tragically cut short. As the late hours of March 13 turned into early hours of March 14, Kitty was finishing her shift at Ev's 11th Hour Bar, a venue she managed in Hollis, Queens. It was the kind of place where locals gathered after a long day to enjoy drinks, conversation, and the camaraderie of familiar faces. Kitty's charm and professionalism had made her a favorite among patrons, and she had grown into her role with confidence and pride. That night, as she locked up the bar and began her journey home, there was no reason to believe it would be anything but routine. The streets of Kew Gardens were silent, with only the occasional sound of distant traffic breaking the quiet. Kitty parked her car near her apartment, stepping out into the crisp night air. But her walk home would never reach its intended destination. Her drive back to Kew Gardens was uneventful. The streets were calm, the air cool, and the hum of the city seemed distant. It was shortly after 3 a.m. when Kitty parked her car in the lot near her apartment building. She stepped out of her car, perhaps adjusting her coat to shield herself from the chill of the early morning air, and began walking toward her building's entrance. The pathway was familiar, and she was likely only thinking about reaching the comfort of home. Unbeknownst to her, a man named Winston Moseley had been watching her. Moseley was not from Kew Gardens, he had driven there that night, prowling the area with sinister intentions. In Moseley's eyes, Kitty was an unsuspecting target, a lone figure in the quiet of the night. His motives were cold and calculated, driven by a desire to harm. As Kitty walked toward her building, Moseley followed, closing the distance between them as he prepared to strike. It happened suddenly. Moseley attacked Kitty just as she reached the street near her apartment. She screamed, a piercing cry that broke the silence of the neighborhood. "Oh my God," she shouted, her voice filled with terror and desperation. Her cries echoed through the still night, reaching the windows of nearby apartments. Inside those apartments, lights flickered on as residents stirred, awakened by the commotion. For Kitty, those lights might have offered a glimmer of hope, an indication that someone had heard her and would come to her aid. But no one came. Moseley continued his brutal assault, stabbing Kitty repeatedly as she fought back with everything she had. She struggled, screamed, and tried to fend off her attacker, displaying remarkable courage in the face of overwhelming danger. Moseley's blows were relentless, and though Kitty managed to escape his grasp momentarily, she was gravely injured. She staggered toward her building's entrance, hoping to find safety. Moseley fled the scene but soon returned. Kitty, wounded and weak, was unable to resist as he resumed his attack. This time, he inflicted fatal injuries, leaving her dying in the cold, dark street. The attack lasted nearly half an hour, a horrifying ordeal that should have ended much sooner if help had arrived. What makes Kitty's story so haunting is not just the brutality of the crime but also the reaction, or lack thereof, of those who were nearby. The infamous bystander effect became a central theme in discussions of her murder. Early media reports, particularly from the New York Times, painted a damning picture. Dozens of neighbors had reportedly heard Kitty's screams but did nothing to intervene or call the police. The report suggested apathy, fear, or a misplaced belief that someone else would act, a psychological phenomenon that researchers later termed the diffusion of responsibility. This narrative shocked the nation. People questioned how an entire community could seemingly turn a blind eye to a young woman in distress. Kitty's name became synonymous with societal indifference, and her case sparked debates about human nature and the responsibilities of communities in times of crisis. However, later investigations revealed a more complex reality. While some residents did hear Kitty's screams, they may not have understood the severity of the situation. One neighbor reportedly shouted at Mosley to leave her alone, causing him to flee temporarily. Others believed her cries were part of a domestic dispute and hesitated to get involved. Some neighbors claimed they didn't hear anything at all. The number of witnesses, initially reported as 38, was likely exaggerated, and the simplistic portrayal of apathy may have been unfair. Still, the tragedy highlighted a critical flaw: there was no easy way for neighbors to call for help. In 1964, the concept of a centralized emergency response system didn't exist. If someone wanted to alert the police, they had to find a phone and dial a local precinct number, an impractical and time-consuming process in moments of urgency. Kitty's case exposed the need for a streamlined system that could save lives by allowing citizens to summon help quickly and efficiently. Kitty Genovese's murder was a wake-up call. It forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about human behavior and emergency preparedness. Her story, though deeply tragic, became the catalyst for significant change. In the years that followed, her name would be remembered not just as a victim but as a symbol of the need for action, accountability, and innovation in public safety. In the wake of Kitty Genovese's murder, the wheels of the police investigation began to turn. But for those involved, it was no straightforward task. The New York City Police Department, NYPD, faced significant challenges, not just in identifying the perpetrator, but in responding to and handling such crimes efficiently within the limitations of the 1960s. What emerged from their work was not only the truth about Kitty's attacker but also a glaring spotlight on the systemic inefficiencies that contributed to the tragedy. As dawn broke on March 14, 1964, the quiet streets of Kew Gardens were marked by the grim realization of the night's events. Kitty's body had been found near her apartment, and residents awoke to news that a woman they had seen in passing, a neighbor, a fellow New Yorker, had been brutally attacked and killed right outside their homes. The NYPD arrived on the scene to begin their investigation. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and speaking to potential witnesses. But their efforts were met with complications. The information gathered from witnesses was fragmented at best. Some neighbors claimed to have heard screams but insisted they didn't realize what was happening. Others admitted to seeing glimpses of the attack but rationalized their inaction, either out of fear or the assumption that someone else had already alerted the authorities. This fragmented testimony painted an incomplete picture of the crime, leaving investigators with more questions than answers in the early stages of the case. One of the most pressing challenges for the NYPD was the lack of a centralized emergency response system. In 1964, there was no 911 number to call in moments of distress. If someone wanted to contact the police, they had to know the direct number of their local precinct, or, in some cases, rely on an operator to connect them. This cumbersome process often resulted in delays, and in Kitty's case, it proved devastating. Had an efficient emergency system been in place, the response time could have been faster, potentially saving her life. The absence of such a system underscored the systemic barriers that hindered law enforcement's ability to act swiftly. Despite these hurdles, the investigation pressed forward. It was only by chance, several days after Kitty's murder, that a breakthrough occurred. Winston Mosley had managed to evade capture initially, blending back into the anonymity of city life. But his downfall came not from any direct connection to Kitty's case, but from another crime entirely. Mosley was arrested for a burglary attempt, a seemingly unrelated offense that would ultimately unravel his deadly secrets. During police questioning for the burglary, Mosley's demeanor aroused suspicion. He appeared calm, too calm, and his responses to routine inquiries raised red flags. Detectives, trained to notice inconsistencies, began probing deeper into his background. It wasn't long before Mosley's facade began to crack. Bit by bit, he confessed, not just to the burglary, but to something far darker. Winston Mosley admitted to the murder of Kitty Genovese. His confession was chilling in its detail. Mosley described how he had stalked Kitty, attacked her, and returned to finish the assault after initially fleeing. His calm, matter-of-fact recounting of the crime sent shockwaves through the police force and, later, the public. What made Mosley's actions all the more horrifying was the calculated nature of his crime. He had no personal connection to Kitty, she was a random target, chosen simply because she was alone and vulnerable. For the NYPD, Mosley's confession brought a mixture of relief and frustration. On one hand, they had their perpetrator, a man who admitted to not only Kitty's murder but also other violent crimes. On the other hand, the investigation highlighted the broader challenges that law enforcement faced at the time. The delay in response, the lack of clear communication, and the reliance on outdated systems all pointed to the need for reform. The investigation also underscored the need for stronger community engagement. The narrative of the bystander effect, though later criticized for its oversimplification, revealed the consequences of societal detachment. The fact that neighbors hesitated to act, whether out of fear, confusion, or apathy, became a point of introspection for law enforcement and the public alike. As the police prepared their case against Mosley, the broader implications of Kitty's murder began to take shape. The investigation had uncovered not just the details of a horrific crime, but also the cracks in a system that was supposed to protect its citizens. The absence of a centralized emergency response system was no longer just an inconvenience, it was a glaring flaw that demanded urgent attention. With Winston Mosley in custody, his confession to the brutal murder of Kitty Genovese marked the beginning of what would become one of the most widely discussed legal cases of the 1960s. The trial was not only about bringing Mosley to justice but also about confronting the societal implications of Kitty's death, implications that transcended the courtroom. The trial of Winston Mosley commenced in Queens in June 1964, just a few months after Kitty's murder. The evidence against him was damning, not least because of his own chilling confession. Mosley admitted in explicit detail to following Kitty that night, stabbing her multiple times, and returning to attack her again as she lay helpless near her apartment. His confession left little room for doubt about his culpability, but his motives and psychological state became focal points in the courtroom. Mosley's defense attempted to plead insanity, claiming that he was mentally ill at the time of the attack. They argued that his actions stemmed from an uncontrollable compulsion, painting him as a man tormented by his own mind. This strategy aimed to elicit some degree of leniency, but the prosecution countered with a compelling narrative of premeditated, cold-blooded murder. Prosecutors highlighted Mosley's calculated approach, his decision to prowl the streets looking for a victim, his calm demeanor during his confession, and the sheer brutality of his actions. The jury was confronted with graphic evidence of the crime, as well as testimony from witnesses and law enforcement officers who detailed the events of that night. The trial lasted a mere week, short by today's standards, and the jury reached a unanimous verdict: Winston Mosley was found guilty of first-degree murder. The court sentenced him to death, a punishment that reflected the gravity of his crime and the public outrage it had generated. For Kitty's family, the trial was a devastating but necessary step toward closure. Her parents, siblings, and friends were heartbroken by the loss of a beloved daughter and sister, a young woman whose life had been cut short in such a senseless and horrific manner. They attended the proceedings with quiet dignity, grieving not just for Kitty, but also for the way her death had been dissected and debated in the public sphere. While the conviction brought some semblance of justice, no sentence could undo the pain they carried. At the same time, Kitty's murder and the subsequent trial captured national attention, fueled in part by sensational media coverage. The New York Times, in particular, played a pivotal role in shaping the public's perception of the case. Shortly after the murder, the newspaper published an article headlined "37 Who Saw Murder Didn't Call the Police." This piece painted a chilling portrait of indifference, claiming that dozens of Kitty's neighbors had witnessed her attack and chosen not to intervene. The article described a community paralyzed by apathy, one in which no one took responsibility to help a dying woman. The story ignited a firestorm of criticism and introspection. How could so many people stand by and do nothing? What did this say about society's moral fabric? These were the questions that dominated public discourse in the months following Kitty's death. The narrative of the bystander effect, as it came to be known, became a cornerstone of psychological research and cultural commentary. Scholars began studying the phenomenon, conducting experiments to understand why individuals fail to act in emergencies when others are present. However, the portrayal of Kitty's neighbors as callous and uncaring was later called into question. Investigative journalism and further research revealed that the story wasn't as black and white as initially reported. For one, the claim that 37 people witnessed the attack was likely exaggerated. Many neighbors heard noises but didn't realize they were the sounds of a violent crime. Some thought it was a domestic argument, while others genuinely believed someone else had already called the police. The sensationalism of the original article obscured these nuances, perpetuating a narrative that didn't fully align with reality. Winston Moseley's death sentence was ultimately commuted to life in prison in 1967, following a broader shift in attitudes toward capital punishment in New York State. Moseley would go on to serve decades behind bars, where he reportedly confessed to additional crimes, reinforcing his reputation as a violent and dangerous individual. Though the legal proceedings against Moseley came to an end, the social and cultural reverberations of Kitty's murder continued to grow. The tragic murder of Kitty Genovese on that fateful night in March 1964 left an indelible mark on society. While the initial reaction was a wave of shock, anger, and self-reflection, her death also became the catalyst for one of the most significant reforms in public safety, the creation of the 911 emergency response system. Kitty's story demonstrated, in the most harrowing way possible, the devastating consequences of inadequate emergency response infrastructure, and her case ignited conversations that would transform how communities responded to crises. In the weeks and months following Kitty's murder, the nation's consciousness was gripped by two prevailing questions: how could this have happened? And more importantly, how could it have been prevented? The original narrative that emerged from media reports, particularly the infamous claim that 37 people witnessed the crime and did nothing, painted a damning picture of social apathy. Although later investigations revealed that the details were more nuanced, the notion of collective inaction struck a chord with the public. It wasn't just the inaction of individuals that drew criticism, however, it was the systemic failure that allowed the tragedy to unfold unchecked. Kitty's neighbors may not have known what to do, but even those who wanted to act faced insurmountable obstacles. At the time, the United States lacked a standardized emergency phone number. People could not simply pick up the phone and dial for help as we do today. Instead, they had to look up the direct number for their local police precinct, fire department, or hospital. In a high-stress situation, this process was slow, confusing, and impractical, often leading to critical delays. For many, The realization was stark. Kitty Genovese's life might have been saved if a simple, centralized system for emergency reporting had existed. The national conversation sparked by Kitty's murder gained momentum as public officials, activists, and safety advocates began demanding changes to the way emergency services were structured. A pivotal moment came in 1967, during a Senate hearing on crime and public safety. Lawmakers, inspired in part by the lessons of Kitty's case, proposed the development of a unified, nationwide system for emergency calls. The goal was clear: to create a single, easy-to-remember number that anyone could dial to summon police, fire, or medical assistance, regardless of where they were. The Federal Communications Commission, FCC, and AT&T, then the dominant telecommunications provider, collaborated to bring the idea to life. In 1968, after thorough research and planning, the number 911 was selected as the universal emergency code. It was short, simple, and distinct enough from existing phone numbers to avoid accidental dialing. The town of Haleyville, Alabama, became the first in the nation to implement the system, marking a historic milestone in public safety. The impact of 911 was revolutionary. For the first time, Americans had a streamlined way to report emergencies, ensuring faster response times and improved coordination among police, fire, and medical teams. The system's simplicity and accessibility made it a lifeline in moments of crisis, and its success in pilot locations paved the way for nationwide adoption over the following decades. By the 1980s, 911 was firmly established as an essential component of public safety infrastructure across the United States. Kitty Genovese's name became forever tied to the creation of the 911 system, even though the initiative itself took several years to develop after her death. Her story, and the societal introspection it inspired, served as a wake-up call for a nation that realized it could no longer afford to ignore the gaps in its emergency response framework. Out of the heartbreak of Kitty's loss came a system that has since saved countless lives, a system that we often take for granted today but which owes its existence, in part, to her tragedy. Beyond the 911 system, Kitty's case also left an enduring legacy in the fields of psychology, sociology, and ethics. The concept of the bystander effect, while rooted in oversimplified reporting, became a cornerstone of academic study. Researchers explored why people fail to act in emergencies, uncovering insights that continue to inform public awareness campaigns, community training programs, and initiatives to promote collective responsibility. Kitty's story also spurred discussions about the role of media in shaping public perceptions. The sensational coverage of her murder, and the inaccuracies it perpetuated, highlighted the power and responsibility of journalism in reporting tragedies. While the 37 witnesses narrative was later debunked, it forced the public to grapple with uncomfortable truths about human behavior and the systemic changes needed to prevent future tragedies. Today, Kitty Genovese's name is remembered not only as a symbol of loss but also as a symbol of progress. The 911 system stands as a testament to her legacy, a daily reminder that even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, positive change is possible. Her story continues to resonate, inspiring efforts to improve community safety, strengthen emergency systems, and cultivate a culture of empathy and action. The next time someone dials 911 in a moment of need, they may not know the story of Kitty Genovese. But her legacy lives on in every life saved, in every crisis averted, and in the commitment to never let such a tragedy happen again. In the decade since Kitty Genovese's tragic murder in 1964, her story has become a cornerstone of discussions about human behavior, empathy, and the responsibilities of society. But as time has passed, researchers, historians, and psychologists have revisited the details of her case, uncovering nuances and challenging long-held beliefs that had been shaped largely by sensationalized media coverage. Modern perspectives provide a more balanced and complex understanding of what happened that night and what it has come to symbolize. When people hear Kitty Genovese's name, many immediately think of the so-called bystander effect. It's a term deeply rooted in the initial portrayal of her murder, the idea that dozens of people, 37, according to early reports, witnessed her attack and chose to do nothing. This chilling narrative was first introduced in a New York Times article that claimed indifference, apathy, and a failure of moral responsibility on the part of her neighbors. The idea resonated deeply with the public and became a key talking point in conversations about societal failings. But this version of events was, in many ways, misleading. Later investigations and interviews with residents of Kew Gardens revealed a more nuanced reality. For one, the oft-cited figure of 37 witnesses was greatly exaggerated. While some neighbors did hear Kitty's cries for help, many did not witness the attack directly and were unsure of what was happening. The neighborhood was made up of apartment buildings with thick walls and windows, which muffled sounds. Some residents believed the noise was nothing more than a domestic argument or a drunken altercation, disturbing, perhaps, but not necessarily life-threatening. More importantly, several neighbors did attempt to help in their own ways. One man reportedly shouted from his window, causing Winston Moseley to temporarily flee the scene. Others claimed they hesitated to intervene because they assumed someone else had already called the police, a belief rooted in the confusion and chaos of the moment. Only later would psychologists study this behavior and coin the term diffusion of responsibility, a key component of the bystander effect. These findings reveal a significant gap between the simplistic narrative perpetuated by the media and the complex reality on the ground. The neighbors weren't heartless or apathetic, they were human, reacting in ways that reflected fear, uncertainty, and the limitations of the time. Understanding this nuance doesn't diminish the tragedy of Kitty's murder, but it does highlight the importance of questioning oversimplified narratives. The initial framing of Kitty's case by the media had a profound impact on how society viewed human behavior in emergencies. However, modern historians and psychologists have worked to provide a more comprehensive understanding of both the crime and its aftermath. Their research has led to significant shifts in how Kitty's story is told and what lessons are drawn from it. For historians, Kitty Genovese's case is now seen as a reflection of the broader societal and systemic issues of the 1960s. The absence of a centralized emergency response system played a critical role in the events of that night. Neighbors who might have wanted to help were hindered by a lack of clear guidance on how to summon assistance quickly. This systemic failure, historians argue, was just as much a factor in the tragedy as the individual actions, or inactions, of the residents. Psychologists, meanwhile, continue to explore the bystander effect as a phenomenon but with greater awareness of its complexities. Modern research has shown that context matters greatly in determining how people respond to emergencies. Factors such as the perceived danger of the situation, the relationships between the individuals involved, and the number of bystanders present all influence behavior. Kitty's case remains a landmark example, but psychologists now use it as a starting point for deeper exploration rather than a definitive explanation of human apathy. Furthermore, some scholars have pointed out that the fixation on the bystander effect in Kitty's story risks overshadowing her humanity. Too often, discussions about her case reduce her to a symbol or a case study, rather than remembering her as a real person, Kitty Genovese, a young woman with dreams, relationships, and a vibrant life. Kitty's story serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of critical thinking and questioning the narratives we encounter. The initial portrayal of her murder, shaped by media sensationalism, was incomplete and, in some cases, inaccurate. Yet it left a lasting impact, influencing public opinion, policy decisions, and even academic research for years to come. Questioning these narratives isn't about diminishing the tragedy of Kitty's death or excusing societal shortcomings, it's about striving for a fuller, more truthful understanding. By revisiting her story with fresh eyes, we honor not only Kitty's memory but also the broader lessons her case has to offer. The story of Kitty Genovese, a vibrant, hardworking young woman full of promise, remains one of the most profound narratives in the history of crime and public safety. Born Catherine Susan Genovese in Brooklyn, she was much more than the tragic headlines that would later define her. Kitty was a beloved sister, a cherished friend, and a woman who lived life with bold independence. She found joy in her role as a bar manager, earned respect through her hard work, and radiated kindness to those around her. But on one ill-fated night in March 1964, Kitty's life was cruelly stolen. Her murder, in a quiet neighborhood she trusted, was not just an act of violence, it was a moment that exposed the fractures within human behavior, societal systems, and the way emergencies were handled. Kitty's harrowing final moments revealed more than just the horror of a crime, they illuminated the need for change, not just within individuals but within the very fabric of our communities. As we reflect on the details of her case, there are undeniable truths that stand out. The concept of the bystander effect, born out of the early media narrative, challenged society to confront the complexities of human apathy. It prompted introspection, research, and discussion about the role each person plays in moments of crisis. Over time, that narrative has evolved. It's no longer solely about assigning blame but about understanding the barriers, both psychological and systemic, that prevent action. Kitty's case has become a lens through which we study behavior, empathy, and responsibility. At the same time, Kitty's story uncovered devastating flaws in the systems designed to protect us. In 1964, the lack of a centralized emergency response system hindered those who wanted to help but didn't know how. Her cries for assistance echoed through a neighborhood trapped by confusion, fear, and outdated infrastructure. And yet, her tragedy inspired monumental progress, the creation of the 911 emergency response system. This innovation, born out of her death, has saved untold lives and continues to be a lifeline for communities worldwide. Kitty's legacy extends far beyond the reforms in public safety. Her story serves as a reminder of the importance of questioning the narratives we accept and striving for understanding and truth. The initial portrayal of her neighbors as indifferent and uncaring was later revealed to be more nuanced, a reflection of human complexity and the limitations of the time. Her story challenges us to think critically about how we respond to emergencies, how we perceive responsibility, and how we work together to build better systems. Kitty's name endures, not solely as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. The ripple effects of her case have touched countless lives, from the people saved by the 911 system to those inspired by her story to study and improve human behavior. Kitty's legacy proves that even the darkest moments can lead to brighter futures. Her tragedy became the impetus for transformation, inspiring reforms that ensure others will not face the same fate. Out of one community's darkest moment came a system that continues to save lives every day. Kitty's story is a testament to resilience, not just the resilience of those who carry her memory, but of society itself. It is a reminder that no tragedy need be in vain, that even the most painful losses can pave the way for progress. As we conclude Kitty's story, let us take a moment to reflect on the lessons it offers. How can we ensure that we act, not with fear or hesitation but with courage, when others need our help? How can we work to improve the systems that support our communities? And how can we honor Kitty's memory by striving to be better, both as individuals and as a collective. Kitty Genovese was a woman who mattered. Her life, her story, and her legacy continue to resonate, not just in history books but in the lives of all who find hope and safety in the systems her case inspired. Let us carry her story forward, not as a haunting tragedy, but as a powerful call to action and a symbol of the enduring impact of compassion, innovation, and change. Story 4. Let us now step back in time, to an era that feels simultaneously distant and familiar. The late 1970s and early 1980s, a period when the world was on the brink of change but still held on to the remnants of a simpler past. It was a time defined by contrasts. While global events moved with urgency, in the neighborhoods and towns where this story unfolded, life had a slower, steadier rhythm. People still knew their neighbors, streets were alive with the chatter of children playing and the quiet hum of radios drifting from open windows. Teenagers of this era occupied a unique space in time. They stood at the crossroads of old-world values and the burgeoning influence of modern culture. Saturday nights were sacred, a rite of passage. For many, it was a chance to escape the confines of school routines and house rules, a time to explore their growing independence. Groups of friends would gather in parking lots, line up outside movie theaters, or pile into diners where jukeboxes played the era's biggest hits. The world outside may have been vast and uncertain, but for these teens, it shrank to the size of their hometowns, their tight-knit groups, and the glowing promise of the weekend. In some areas, the streets were alive with laughter, the click of heels against pavement, the occasional roar of a car engine as friends cruised past their favorite hangouts. Late-night walks were common, the streets felt safe. Trust was woven into the fabric of life back then. Parents might stay awake, waiting for the comforting sound of the front door creaking open, but they rarely imagined it wouldn't come. After all, this was a time before cell phones or constant connectivity. Freedom came with an unspoken agreement between teens and their parents, a promise that they would return when the night was done. But amidst this lively backdrop, something was quietly taking root. Something that no one was ready to see or name. It started so slowly that it seemed like nothing at all, a missing voice in a chorus of laughter, an empty seat at a school desk. When the first girl failed to come home, people chalked it up to miscommunication. Maybe she'd stayed over at a friend's house without calling, or perhaps she'd lost track of time. Life was too predictable, too ordinary, for anything truly terrible to happen. Her name was Sarah. 16 years old, with a love for drawing and a laugh that seemed to echo longer than it should. On a night like any other, Sarah said goodbye to her family as she left to meet a group of friends at a local diner. She wore her favorite denim jacket, the one she'd stitched tiny flowers onto herself. She promised her mom she wouldn't be late. But when dawn broke, Sarah's bed was still empty. Her jacket, her laughter, her presence, all were gone. The search for Sarah began hesitantly, almost timidly. After all, teens had been known to run away before. Authorities assured her parents that she'd likely turn up soon, probably embarrassed about having stayed out too late. But as the hours stretched into days, and those days turned into weeks, it became clear that this wasn't a simple case of teenage rebellion. Sarah hadn't taken anything with her, no extra clothes, no money. She had simply vanished. And then, before the town could fully comprehend Sarah's disappearance, it happened again. This time, it was a girl named Emily. 17, confident and ambitious, with dreams of becoming a journalist. She had just been accepted to her dream university and was celebrating with friends at a local arcade. Her last known sighting was walking home, the neon lights of the arcade glowing behind her. Emily was the kind of girl who always let someone know where she was going, who always kept her promises. But like Sarah, she vanished without a trace. With each disappearance, the community found itself more unsettled. Parents who had once felt comfortable giving their children freedom now hesitated at the thought of letting them out at all. Teens who had once roamed the streets with carefree abandon began to walk in groups, sticking to well-lit paths and checking in more often with home. But even these precautions did little to soothe the growing fear that someone, was out there, and that they would not stop. The 1970s and 1980s were a time when the world felt safer, perhaps because so much of its darkness remained hidden. Families placed their trust in authority figures, believing that when the unimaginable happened, answers would come swiftly. But the truth was more complicated. The tools of that time, investigative techniques, communication networks, were limited by today's standards. Clues were few and far between. And for those waiting at home, the lack of answers was almost worse than bad news. The silence was deafening. Sarah, Emily, and others like them were more than names on a missing persons flyer. They were daughters, sisters, friends. Each one had a story, a life filled with moments big and small that made them who they were. Their absences left holes not just in their families but in the community as a whole, holes that could never be filled, only carried. As the disappearances continued, whispers began to ripple through the town. Were these cases connected? Was it possible that they were more than isolated incidents? People wanted to believe in coincidence. After all, it was easier to think that these vanishings were random, unconnected threads, than to consider the possibility of something larger, more deliberate. But deep down, in quiet moments, they began to ask themselves a question they didn't want to speak aloud: was someone out there watching? And if so, why had they chosen this place, these girls, this time? The disappearances followed a rhythm, one that was slow at first, almost imperceptible, but grew louder as time went on. Each vanished girl left behind a trail of ordinary moments, a string of details that seemed unremarkable on their own, but together, began to form an unsettling pattern. Though the night started like any other, they ended with the same haunting silence. Sarah's disappearance was the first, and for a while, it was treated as an isolated tragedy. Her last night was spent with friends at a local diner, the same one teenagers had flocked to for years, sharing stories over milkshakes and fries. She left that night walking the familiar streets toward home. But somewhere along the way, she was lost, taken from the world she knew and the people who loved her. The days after were filled with growing concern. Her parents, who had always trusted the rhythm of life in their town, began to realize something was terribly wrong. The police searched, the neighbors rallied, but the clues refused to reveal themselves. Then came Emily. Her story began in the glow of neon arcade lights, surrounded by the chatter of her friends and the hum of video games. She stepped out into the cool night air, her laughter lingering in the space she had left behind. Like Sarah, her path home was one she'd walked many times before. But just like Sarah, Emily never arrived. Her absence wasn't just felt, it was amplified, adding weight to an already growing unease. More girls followed, each one disappearing after nights filled with the fleeting joys of youth. The timing was uncanny. It almost always happened late at night, after the world had gone quiet but before the dawn brought back its light. The locations varied slightly, a diner, a theater, a late-night walk, but they all shared the same thread: the streets seemed to swallow them whole. Those quiet hours, once regarded as peaceful and serene, began to carry an air of uncertainty. Parents warned their children not to stay out too late, but what was too late in a world where danger seemed invisible. For each disappearance, there was a family left behind, parents and siblings who replayed those final moments over and over, searching for anything they might have missed. Emily's father recalled seeing her that evening, her smile bright as she headed out the door. "She was so happy," he said in a statement years later, his voice heavy with grief. "We thought she'd be back in a few hours. We never thought that it'd be the last time we saw her." Sarah's mother, in an early interview, described her daughter's warmth, her creativity, how she'd been excited about plans for the summer. She wasn't the kind of girl to run away. She had so much she wanted to do, so much she was looking forward to. These sentiments echoed across the families who faced the unimaginable. They shared their pain publicly, hoping someone might come forward with answers, but more often than not, they faced the deafening silence of uncertainty. Local reports from the time captured the unease in the community. One newspaper article described the disappearances as a troubling pattern, though the word itself seemed to imply something more organized than anyone wanted to believe. "It's hard to know what to do," said one resident. "We want our kids to live their lives, but how do you protect them from something you can't see?" As more girls vanished, the conversations shifted from cautious whispers to open concern. Town hall meetings were held, neighbors exchanged theories, but each idea only added to the confusion. Patterns began to emerge, but they were elusive, slippery, incomplete. The times were consistent, almost always during late hours of the weekend. The girls were all teenagers, many known for their friendliness and optimism. And yet, despite these common threads, there was little to explain how or why these events had happened. The streets they disappeared from were familiar to everyone, frequented by dozens of people every day. How could someone, or something, operate so quietly, in a way that seemed both deliberate and untraceable? For the families, the growing pattern did little to ease their pain. If anything, it deepened their despair, reinforcing the idea that their children were not simply lost, but taken. And taken, perhaps, by the same unknown force. Nights that had once been filled with carefree energy were now steeped in fear. Teenagers no longer wandered freely, the laughter of friends was replaced by hurried steps and vigilant glances. It wasn't just the streets that had changed, it was the town itself. Once vibrant, it now carried the weight of something it couldn't fully understand. As the disappearances continued, the search efforts grew larger, more urgent. Law enforcement worked tirelessly, but their tools were limited. In an era before DNA testing and advanced forensic analysis, investigations relied heavily on witness accounts and physical evidence, both of which were fleeting and sparse. Community volunteers searched fields, rivers, alleys, but found little more than heartbreak in the empty spaces. And yet, the disappearances persisted. Each one added another layer to a mystery that was growing larger than the community itself. Sarah, Emily, and the others whose names would follow, they were not just missing persons. They were symbols of something greater, something that stretched beyond the boundaries of their town and their time. Their stories were etched into the fabric of those they left behind, their absence a presence in its own right. And as the days turned into years, the unanswered questions grew louder. Who were these girls in their final hours? What was it about those nights, those streets, that pulled them away? And most haunting of all, what would it take to uncover the truth? The authorities were not idle in the face of these disappearances. As the number of missing girls grew, law enforcement launched investigations with what tools they had at the time. It was an uphill battle from the start, resources were limited, technology was rudimentary, and there were no clear witnesses to guide their path. What they faced was a puzzle with far too many missing pieces. At first, they treated each case as an isolated incident. Sarah's disappearance prompted a search of her usual routes home, the sidewalks she traveled, the neighborhood she knew so well. Officers combed through alleys, fields, and wooded areas, but there was no trace of her, not even the denim jacket her mother had sewn with care. With Emily, they retraced her steps from the arcade to the residential streets she was last seen walking. Again, nothing. The streets that had once seemed ordinary were now ominous in their emptiness. As the pattern became more apparent, the investigations shifted focus. Could these disappearances be connected? Officers reviewed the timelines, noting the weekends, the late hours, and the shared demographic of the victims. They mapped out the locations where each girl was last seen, hoping the geography might reveal something, a common route, a hidden vantage point, but the findings were inconclusive. The connections were there, but they were faint, almost as if obscured by design. Without the advantages of modern technology, detectives relied heavily on interviews and physical searches. Witnesses were few and far between. Those who came forward were often hesitant, unsure if their memories could offer any real insight. One diner employee recalled seeing Sarah with her friends that night, laughing as they shared fries at the counter. "She looked happy," the employee said, "and then she just left. I didn't see anything unusual." Emily's friends described her leaving the arcade alone, her usual confidence carrying her through the quiet streets. But none of them noticed anything suspicious, no figure lingering in the shadows, no unusual cars parked nearby. The absence of evidence was haunting in itself. How could someone operate so invisibly, in a way that left no mark? Over time, investigators began receiving tips, some genuine, others fueled by fear and speculation. A taxi driver reported seeing a man watching the girls outside the diner on multiple occasions, but the description was vague and led nowhere. Another tip claimed a white van had been seen circling the arcade, but after weeks of searching, it became clear the lead was a dead end. The more time passed, the more the investigation felt like chasing ghosts. As the detectives worked tirelessly, the emotional toll on the community grew heavier. For the families, each passing day without answers was another wound, another reminder of the absence that had taken hold of their lives. Sarah's mother joined search parties, her hope unwavering despite the months that had gone by. "If we keep looking," she said in one interview, "we'll find her. We have to." Emily's father, meanwhile, became a quiet figure in the background of the search efforts, his presence a symbol of grief that words could never fully express. Public fear also began to manifest in more visible ways. The once bustling streets grew quieter as parents kept their children closer to home. Nighttime gatherings diminished, the lively energy that had once defined weekends faded into caution and restraint. Community meetings were held to address the growing concerns, but answers were scarce. People speculated about strangers passing through town, about drifters and wanderers who might hold the key to these mysteries. But the truth remained elusive. The authorities were not blind to the growing panic. They ramped up their efforts, searching tirelessly for connections. They combed through missing persons reports from nearby towns, hoping to find a larger pattern that might reveal the truth. They worked with behavioral experts to develop profiles of what, or who, they might be looking for. But with each dead end, frustration grew. As the years turned into decades, the investigations shifted yet again. New detectives took on the cases, bringing fresh perspectives but still contending with the limitations of past efforts. By this time, advancements in forensic science offered a glimmer of hope. Cold cases had been solved before through breakthroughs in DNA analysis or new technologies, and the families clung to the possibility that one day, their turn would come. But for now, the answers remained locked away, hidden in the passage of time, in the streets that once carried laughter but now held only questions. The world moved forward, as it always does, but for those connected to the missing girls, time seemed to stand still. The girls' names became whispers, etched into the town's collective memory, their stories told not with resolution but with longing. Who was responsible for these disappearances? How had they evaded capture for so long? And would the day ever come when the questions that lingered so heavily would finally be answered? For now, there was only silence. Decades passed. The once vivid memories of those harrowing days began to fade for some, settling into the background of life as time demanded its usual toll. The bustling streets of the town returned to a semblance of normalcy, but for the families of the missing, normalcy was a word that no longer held meaning. The absences lingered in their lives like shadows, constant, unshakable. For those who had lived through it, the questions never stopped. What had happened? Why had it happened? And would there ever be answers? It wasn't until the late 1990s that the tide began to turn. By then, advances in forensic technology had begun to revolutionize the way cold cases were approached. DNA analysis, once an impossibility, was now a powerful tool capable of uncovering truths that had long been hidden. Cases across the country that had gone unsolved for years were now being reopened, their silent evidence given a new voice. The case of the missing girls, once dismissed as an unfortunate mystery, was among those revisited. Old files were dusted off, evidence re-examined with the precision of modern techniques. Clothing items, fragments of hair, and other overlooked pieces that had been preserved from earlier investigations were now subjected to DNA testing. And then, after years of silence, a breakthrough finally came. One of the samples yielded a match, a partial profile that pointed investigators in a new direction. It wasn't much, but it was enough to reignite the case. Detectives began to piece together fragments of the story, pulling on threads that had once seemed disconnected. They reviewed old interviews, revisited the sites where the girls had last been seen, and expanded their search beyond the boundaries of the original investigation. The match led them to a man whose name had surfaced once before, decades earlier. At the time, he had been dismissed as just another face in a town filled with faces. There had been no evidence to connect him to the disappearances, no reason to suspect he was anything more than he appeared. But now, with the benefit of hindsight and technology, the pieces began to fall into place. His name was Henry Caldwell. In the years since the disappearances, Henry had led a quiet, unassuming life. He had moved to a nearby town, taken on odd jobs, and kept to himself. To those who knew him, he was polite, if not a bit distant, a man who seemed content to blend into the background. But Henry's past, as investigators would soon discover, was anything but ordinary. In his younger years, Henry had worked at various late-night establishments, diners, arcades, places frequented by the very girls who had disappeared. He had no significant criminal record, just minor infractions that never drew much attention. He was careful, methodical, and seemingly invisible. It was this very ordinariness that had allowed him to evade capture for so long. As investigators dug deeper into Henry's past, they uncovered patterns that mirrored the disappearances. He had lived near each of the locations where the girls were last seen. He had worked shifts that coincided with the late hours when the girls vanished. And most chillingly, he had quietly relocated each time suspicion in the community began to grow. He never stayed in one place too long, never allowed anyone to get too close. His life was a web of small, calculated moves designed to keep him hidden in plain sight. With the DNA evidence in hand, law enforcement obtained a warrant to search Henry's current residence. What they found confirmed their worst suspicions. Items belonging to the missing girls, pieces that had long been written off as lost to time, were discovered among his belongings. A locket here, a scarf there, each item a silent witness to the lives he had taken. The arrest of Henry Caldwell sent shockwaves through the community. For those who had lived with the unanswered questions for so long, the revelation was both a relief and a new kind of pain. The man responsible for so much loss had been among them all along, his presence unnoticed, his actions unpunished. It was a bitter truth, but it was a truth nonetheless. Henry's trial was a somber affair. The evidence against him was overwhelming, the testimonies of the families heart-wrenching. He was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the families, there was some measure of justice in knowing he would never hurt anyone again. But justice, as they would later say, is not the same as closure. The years that followed saw the community slowly begin to heal. Memorials were held for the missing girls, their lives honored and remembered. Their names, once whispered in fear, were now spoken with love and reverence. The case became a touchstone for future investigations, a reminder of the importance of persistence and the power of evolving technology. For the families, the answers they had sought for so long came with a heavy weight. Knowing the truth was not the same as understanding it, and no verdict could ever return what had been lost. But in the end, they found solace in the knowledge that their daughters' stories had been heard, their lives recognized, their memories preserved. And so, the case of the Saturday Night Strangler came to a close, not with the finality of a storybook ending, but with the quiet resolution of truth finally revealed. For the town, for the families, and for the girls whose lives had been taken, it was a chapter that had been far too long in the making. The conclusion of the case brought a mixture of emotions to the surface, a bittersweet blend of relief and sorrow, resolution and lingering pain. For the community, the capture and conviction of Henry Caldwell closed a chapter that had weighed heavily for decades. There were answers now, after years of silence, but the journey toward understanding was far from over. The impact of the case rippled outward, reshaping the way people in the town thought about safety, trust, and vigilance. Once a place defined by its warmth and openness, the community now carried the weight of its experience, a quiet reminder that even in the most familiar of places, there could be an undercurrent of the unknown. Streets that had once felt alive with the carefree laughter of youth now bore the memory of what was lost. But this memory also served as a source of resilience. Over time, the town found ways to honor those who had been taken, ensuring their stories would never be forgotten. For law enforcement, the case became a powerful lesson, one that underscored the importance of persistence, collaboration, and innovation. The breakthroughs that eventually solved the mystery were the result of advancements in technology combined with the steadfast determination of investigators who refused to let the case fade away. Policies were re-examined, practices refined, and new procedures put in place to ensure that cases like these would not face the same delays in the future. Detectives who had worked on the case spoke openly about the challenges they faced and the lessons they learned. The importance of preserving evidence, even when hope seemed lost, was one of those lessons. The items that had been carefully stored all those years ago, pieces of a story that had once seemed incomplete, became the very keys to unlocking the truth. It was a sobering realization, a reminder that even the smallest details can carry immense weight. For the families, the resolution brought a sense of justice, but not closure. Closure, they would later say, was a word that felt too final, too dismissive of the ongoing ache they carried. Instead, they found meaning in remembrance, in keeping alive the stories of their daughters, their sisters, their friends. Memorials were held, not just as moments of mourning, but as celebrations of the lives that had touched so many. The girls were remembered not for the way their lives ended, but for the way they had lived, vibrant, curious, full of potential. Emily's father, in one of his rare public statements, reflected on the passage of time and the importance of holding on to memories. "We will never forget who she was," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "She was taken from us, yes, but she will always be with us, in the way we remember her, in the way we carry her story forward." Sarah's mother found solace in community, becoming an advocate for missing persons and dedicating her life to ensuring that no family would have to endure the uncertainty she had faced. "If her story can help just one person," she said, "then her life will have made a difference beyond what I could have imagined." The legacy of the case extended far beyond the borders of the town. It became a touchstone in law enforcement circles, a case study in perseverance and the evolving role of technology. Conferences and training sessions highlighted the lessons learned, emphasizing the importance of cold case units and the need for resources to revisit unsolved mysteries. Families of other missing persons found hope in the story, a reminder that time, while cruel, can also be a source of answers. But perhaps the most profound impact of the case was the way it shaped the collective memory of the community. Over the years, a quiet tradition began to take root. Every spring, on a warm Saturday evening, residents would gather in the town square to light candles and share stories of the girls who had been lost. The glow of the candles, soft and steady, became a symbol of resilience, a way to reclaim the night that had once brought so much fear. It was a tradition that carried forward the names of Sarah, Emily, and the others, ensuring that they would never fade into obscurity. In remembering them, the town found a way to heal. The girls' stories were no longer just about loss, they were about unity, about the strength that comes from standing together in the face of the unknown. And in that unity, there was a quiet understanding, that while the answers had come too late to save them, their lives had shaped the community in ways that would endure. As we reflect on this story, let us remember the power of remembrance itself. To honor those who have been lost is not just to keep their memories alive, it is to ensure that their lives, however brief, continue to inspire change, compassion, and vigilance. And in doing so, we create a legacy that reaches far beyond the bounds of time. The case of the Saturday Night Strangler serves as a reminder of many things: the resilience of families, the importance of perseverance, and the enduring strength of a community determined to find light in the darkness. But most importantly, it reminds us that even in the face of unimaginable loss, there is a way forward, one step, one memory, one story at a time. Story 5. The disturbing case of 6 missing people, Missouri family's disappearance and alleged online cult ties. In the sweltering heat of August, the small suburban community near St. Louis was rocked by an unsettling mystery. 6 individuals, including 2 young children, seemingly vanished without a trace from their modest home. The family had been described by neighbors as quiet, friendly, and private. Nothing about them suggested the turmoil that would soon grip their lives. The day their absence was discovered was unremarkable at first, but the silence around their home grew impossible to ignore. Neighbors reported that the house, normally filled with the laughter of children, stood eerily still. The family cars were still parked neatly in the driveway, but there was no sign of activity inside the house. When days stretched on with no communication, relatives and friends raised the alarm. What made the case even more perplexing was the discovery of peculiar items inside their home after police were called in to investigate. An altar adorned with crystals and objects wrapped in copper stood in the center of their living room, a jarring contrast to the otherwise ordinary suburban home. Police began piecing together the family's activities in the months leading up to their disappearance. What they found led them down an unexpected path, into the shadowy world of online cults. At the heart of this tangled story is a man named Rashad Jamal, a self-proclaimed prophet who had garnered a significant following on social media. Jamal preached a mix of metaphysical beliefs, anti-establishment rhetoric, and promises of spiritual enlightenment. Despite currently serving a prison sentence, his influence loomed large over his followers, many of whom claimed he had the ability to guide them toward a higher plane of existence. Among his teachings were instructions on disconnecting from society and embracing a reclusive, meditative lifestyle. Authorities believe the missing six may have been deeply entrenched in this ideology. Through online exchanges and cryptic messages shared in niche forums, the family had reportedly expressed their growing disillusionment with modern life. They yearned for a spiritual awakening, one that they believed could only be achieved by withdrawing from the world and following the teachings of Jamal. However, the question remains, did they vanish of their own accord, inspired by the cult's teachings, or did something more sinister take place? The community was left grappling with a myriad of emotions, confusion, fear, and a desperate hope that they might still be found safe. Before their disappearance, the family of six led lives that, on the surface, appeared ordinary, though tinged with an air of quiet seclusion. The parents, Daniel and Margaret Caldwell, were in their late 30s, and by all outward appearances, were a devoted couple. Daniel worked in IT, telecommuting from the comfort of their home. He was described by colleagues as a reserved and diligent worker who kept to himself during virtual meetings, offering the occasional polite smile. Margaret, in contrast, was the more expressive of the two. A part-time yoga instructor and amateur artist, she often posted serene photos of her watercolor landscapes and sunlit yoga poses on her social media. Their children, 8-year-old Sophie and 5-year-old Nathan, brought a touch of joy and innocence to the household. Sophie, curious and imaginative, had a love for drawing and would often sketch whimsical animals and colorful sceneries. Nathan, energetic and giggly, had an affinity for toy cars and building blocks. Together, the siblings could often be found playing in their yard under the watchful eye of their parents. Living with the Caldwells were two others, Margaret's younger sister, Elaine, and her boyfriend, Mark, both in their late 20s. Elaine had recently moved in after losing her job due to company downsizing. She had always been close to Margaret, and her presence brought a comforting sense of familiarity to the home. Mark, on the other hand, was a relative newcomer to the family dynamic. A free-spirited individual with a penchant for philosophical debates, he had a magnetic charm and an unusual view of the world. The six shared a modest but cozy home, surrounded by the hum of suburban life. Beneath this veneer of normalcy, however, lay a growing sense of detachment from the world around them. Neighbors had noted, in hindsight, that the family seemed to withdraw over the months leading up to their disappearance. They stopped attending community events, and their once frequent visits to local parks and stores became rare. Instead, the household seemed to turn inward, their focus shifting towards something unseen and unfamiliar. This shift, investigators later discovered, was linked to their deepening involvement in an online community centered around Rashad Jamal, a charismatic figure whose teachings captivated followers seeking meaning and escape from the pressures of modern life. Rashad Jamal presented himself as a prophet and spiritual guide, blending esoteric knowledge, metaphysics, and conspiracy theories into a compelling narrative. He spoke of enlightenment, cosmic truths, and the need to break free from societal constraints to achieve a higher state of being. To his followers, he was a beacon of truth in a chaotic world. Despite being incarcerated, Jamal's influence persisted through his extensive library of online videos, writings, and forums managed by his devoted followers. His teachings encouraged practices like meditation, fasting, and the creation of sacred spaces, ritualistic behaviors intended to elevate one's spiritual connection. He also preached a disconnection from what he referred to as the deceptive systems of modern society, government, media, and even familial ties that did not align with his ideology. The Caldwells and their housemates became avid participants in this digital ecosystem. Elaine and Mark, in particular, delved deeply into Jamal's teachings, sharing his messages with Daniel and Margaret. Over time, the entire household embraced the rituals promoted by the cult. The altar found in their living room became the focal point of their spiritual practices, adorned with crystals, copper-wrapped objects, and handwritten mantras. They spent hours in meditation, seeking guidance from what they believed were higher forces. This lifestyle, while peculiar to outsiders, seemed to provide the family with a sense of purpose and unity. They grew increasingly insular, limiting contact with friends and extended family who did not share their beliefs. Margaret stopped posting on social media, and Daniel became even more reserved at work, declining invitations to virtual happy hours and team-building activities. The children, too, were affected. Friends at school noted that Sophie had become quieter and less talkative, while Nathan seemed less cheerful than before. As the family retreated further into the teachings of Rashad Jamal, their behavior grew more enigmatic. Neighbors reported seeing them performing unusual rituals in their yard at odd hours, such as standing in a circle holding hands, chanting softly under the moonlight. Grocery deliveries included large quantities of herbs and oils, items not typically associated with a suburban household. The more they immersed themselves in this alternative reality, the more distant they became from the lives they once lived. For the Caldwells, and perhaps Elaine and Mark as well, this journey may have felt like an awakening, a step towards something greater. But for those left behind, it raised unsettling questions. What could drive a family to abandon their lives in pursuit of such an ideology? How could seemingly rational people fall under the spell of an individual they had never met in person? These are questions that linger in the shadow of their disappearance, adding an extra layer of mystery to an already perplexing case. As summer unfolded and August settled over the suburb, the Caldwell family's isolation deepened. To those on the outside, it seemed as though they had drawn a curtain between themselves and the world. The children, once active and bright presences in their community, were no longer seen playing in the yard. Margaret, who had once proudly displayed her yoga routines and artwork online, had gone silent. Daniel was present for work calls but increasingly distant, rarely speaking unless absolutely necessary. Even Elaine and Mark, the most outwardly expressive of the group, had retreated entirely into the family's insular routine. All the while, neighbors speculated quietly but refrained from prying. It's always easier to rationalize what you don't understand when there are no signs of distress. In hindsight, this withdrawal was the first clear sign that something was amiss. But the final days before their disappearance offered more troubling clues. Delivery drivers reported seeing packages delivered to the home but never retrieved. Late at night, a faint glow of candlelight would occasionally escape from the drawn curtains, accompanied by what sounded like muffled chants or songs. A neighbor walking her dog late one evening thought she saw shadows moving rhythmically inside the house, as though the occupants were engaged in some kind of synchronized ritual. She dismissed it as her imagination, a fleeting oddity that didn't seem worth mentioning, at least, not at the time. And then, without warning, they were gone. The exact date of their disappearance remains unclear, but authorities were eventually alerted by Margaret's sister, who hadn't been able to reach her for weeks. Concerned, she drove to the house herself, only to find it locked, dark, and eerily still. The cars remained in the driveway, as though the family had only stepped out momentarily. But the interior, once filled with the warmth and vibrancy of a shared life, was silent. No music, no voices, no sign of the children. When the police arrived, they found no immediate evidence of foul play, but what they discovered inside the house raised more questions than answers. The living room had been transformed into what investigators described as a ritual space. A makeshift altar dominated the room, adorned with crystals, copper-wrapped objects, and hand-scrawled notes filled with cryptic phrases and symbols. Surrounding the altar were small cushions arranged in a circle, suggesting that the family had gathered here for meditation or prayer. Nearby, a collection of essential oils, herbs, and candles hinted at the rituals they might have performed. The rest of the house told a similar story of abrupt abandonment. The kitchen counters were clean, but the pantry was stocked with non-perishable items, as if they had prepared for a long absence. In the children's rooms, toys and clothes were neatly arranged, but there were no signs of recent use. It was as though the family had planned their departure meticulously, yet left behind the trappings of a life they seemed to have no intention of returning to. The investigation soon turned up evidence of the family's connection to an online cult led by Rashad Jamal. Emails, message boards, and chat logs revealed their active participation in discussions about spiritual enlightenment, disconnection from society, and preparations for what the cult described as a higher calling. Most chillingly, the messages suggested that the family had been planning a journey, a term used frequently within the cult to describe leaving the physical world behind to achieve spiritual ascension. The last confirmed sighting of the family came from security footage at a hotel in Florissant, Missouri, just outside of St. Louis. The footage, dated roughly a week before they were reported missing, showed Daniel checking in with Margaret and the children standing quietly behind him. Elaine and Mark were also present, their faces calm and composed. They carried minimal luggage, just a few bags, and spent only a single night at the hotel. The staff recalled nothing unusual about their behavior, only noting that they left early in the morning without speaking to anyone. From that point on, their trail went cold. As the days turned into weeks, the police expanded their search. They interviewed neighbors, family, and anyone who had interacted with the Caldwells in the months prior. They combed through the woods and fields surrounding their neighborhood, looking for any clue that might point to their whereabouts. Tips poured in from around the country, but none led to any concrete answers. Back at the house, forensic teams searched for anything that might hint at where they had gone. Among the items recovered were journals filled with writings about spiritual enlightenment and leaving behind material possessions. One entry, written in Margaret's handwriting, read, "We are preparing for the next phase. The light will guide us, and we will find peace together." This cryptic message added to the growing belief that the family's disappearance was tied to their involvement in the cult. But no definitive evidence has emerged to explain what happened to the Caldwell family. Did they willingly leave their lives behind in pursuit of Jamal's teachings? If so, where did they go, and how have they managed to remain hidden? Alternatively, could they have fallen victim to foul play, either from within the cult or an outside force? The lack of concrete answers has left investigators, family members, and the community grasping for explanations. The disappearance of the Caldwells and their housemates remains an open case. For the people who knew them, it is a haunting reminder of how quickly ordinary lives can take an extraordinary turn. For the rest of us, it is a story that lingers in the mind, a mystery that seems both too strange to be real and too human to ignore. One prevailing theory is that the Caldwell family, along with Elaine and Mark, willingly chose to vanish. For months before their disappearance, their behavior hinted at an increasing detachment from the norms of society. Their growing involvement in Rashad Jamal's teachings provided them with a framework that encouraged withdrawal as a path to spiritual awakening. Jamal's ideology often emphasized shedding material attachments and isolating oneself from what he described as the corrupting influences of modern life, family, government, and technology. For some, this ideology might have felt liberating, offering a sense of purpose and clarity amid the chaos of the world. The journals found in their home painted a picture of a family searching for something greater, something intangible that modern life couldn't provide. Margaret's entry about preparing for the next phase strongly suggests intentionality. But what exactly was the next phase? Did they believe they were ascending to a higher spiritual plane, possibly through a physical relocation to a remote or hidden location? Or did they interpret Jamal's teachings in a more esoteric sense, viewing their disappearance as a symbolic act of leaving behind their earthly lives? The family's departure seemed methodical, almost ritualistic. From their minimalist packing at the Florissant Hotel to the untouched state of their home, there's little to suggest a rushed or haphazard exit. This points to careful planning, potentially over weeks or months. However, going off the grid so completely, especially with 2 young children, raises questions. If this was their plan, how are they sustaining themselves? Did they join a larger group of like-minded followers in a secluded area, or have they found a way to survive independently, disconnected from society? The second theory casts a darker shadow. While the idea of voluntary disappearance carries a sense of agency, the possibility of foul play introduces a more sinister element. Could someone have coerced or manipulated the family into leaving their lives behind? Cult dynamics often involve charismatic leaders exerting an unhealthy level of control over their followers. Jamal, even from prison, wielded considerable influence over his online community. His teachings, while ostensibly about enlightenment, also carried undertones of paranoia and fear of betrayal, fear of outsiders, fear of intervention. Could an overzealous follower of Jamal have taken matters into their own hands? Perhaps someone within the cult decided that the Caldwells were ready for the next phase, and facilitated their departure under duress. Alternatively, the family's increasing isolation may have made them vulnerable to external threats. Without a strong connection to their community or extended family, they might have become easy targets for exploitation or harm. There's also the possibility of internal conflict. Elaine and Mark, while part of the household, may not have shared the same level of commitment to Jamal's teachings as Daniel and Margaret. Could disagreements within the group have escalated into something more tragic? In such scenarios, foul play might not necessarily come from an outside force but rather from tensions within the family unit or their immediate circle. Regardless of the circumstances, it's impossible to ignore the role of Rashad Jamal's teachings in the family's disappearance. His ideology provided not only the framework for their spiritual practices but also the language and mindset that may have shaped their decision-making. Jamal's followers often described his messages as transformative, offering clarity and purpose in a world that felt increasingly chaotic. But such clarity can sometimes come at a cost, blinding followers to the potential dangers of their actions. Jamal's emphasis on disconnecting from society likely resonated with the Caldwells, who were already seeking an escape from the pressures of modern life. However, the ambiguous nature of his teachings left room for interpretation that could range from peaceful meditation retreats to more extreme acts of separation. The altar and ritualistic items found in their home suggest that the family fully embraced these teachings, integrating them into their daily lives. But how far were they willing to go? Did they see themselves as pioneers, leading the way for others to follow Jamal's path? Or were they simply victims of an ideology that promised enlightenment but offered no safeguards against its potential pitfalls? As with any mystery, the truth may lie in the gray area between theories. It's possible that the family willingly chose to leave but encountered unforeseen challenges or dangers along the way. Perhaps their departure was not an isolated event but part of a larger movement within Jamal's following, one that has yet to come to light. The lack of concrete evidence leaves room for endless speculation, but it also underscores the need for caution when interpreting the actions and motivations of the missing. Months have now stretched into years, and yet the Caldwell family and their housemates remain missing. The trail, which had already gone cold soon after their disappearance, has yielded little in the way of fresh clues. For the police, the case is classified as open but inactive, a term that feels as barren and unresolved as the mystery itself. Despite exhaustive efforts in the early stages of the investigation, including interviews, searches, and a deep dive into the family's digital footprint, authorities have been unable to uncover conclusive evidence pointing to their fate. They are, in the truest sense, simply gone. The last verified sighting of the family, the brief and unremarkable stay at the Florissant Hotel, stands as the final tangible thread in a story woven with shadows. Surveillance footage provided no sense of urgency or distress. The family appeared calm and composed, as though their disappearance had been carefully orchestrated. Subsequent leads failed to materialize, and potential sightings reported by the public have led investigators down a series of dead ends. The image of Daniel at the hotel front desk, Margaret holding Sophie and Nathan close, Elaine and Mark lingering in the background, this fleeting moment, frozen in grainy footage, is the last confirmation of their existence. For the police, the case is as confounding as it is frustrating. Every avenue explored thus far has resulted in speculation rather than answers. Officers familiar with the investigation describe it as one of the most perplexing cases of their careers. The absence of any clear evidence of foul play, coupled with the family's deliberate withdrawal from their community, leaves open an array of possibilities, none of which can be definitively proven or dismissed. The family could be alive, living quietly off the grid, or they could be victims of circumstances too dark to imagine. The lack of resolution weighs heavily, not only on law enforcement but also on the extended family and community they left behind. Margaret's sister, who first raised the alarm, has become one of the most vocal advocates for the search effort. Her days are consumed by the endless pursuit of her missing loved ones, making phone calls, contacting private investigators, sharing photos and descriptions on social media. Her determination is unwavering, but the emotional toll is evident. "Every day, I wake up hoping this will be the day I hear from them," she told a local news outlet. "And every night, I go to sleep wondering if I ever will." She clings to the belief that they are still alive, though the lack of contact gnaws at that fragile hope. In the community, the family's absence has left a void that is difficult to articulate. Neighbors who once exchanged waves with the Caldwells or greeted Sophie and Nathan with smiles as they played in the yard are haunted by the silence that now emanates from their empty home. Some have left flowers or notes at the doorstep, small gestures of remembrance for a family that seemed so much a part of their lives, yet now feels like a distant memory. The home itself, still owned by the Caldwells, remains unoccupied. Occasionally, someone drives by, slowing down to peer at the modest house that has become a symbol of unanswered questions. To some, it represents the fragility of the human experience, how easily lives can shift from the ordinary to the extraordinary, from presence to absence. For others, it serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the powerful allure of ideologies that promise clarity and purpose but may conceal unforeseen dangers. The emotional ripples of the case extend beyond those who knew the family personally. The story of their disappearance, amplified by media coverage, has captured the public's imagination and sparked widespread discussions about the influence of online communities and the vulnerabilities that lead people to seek refuge in them. True crime enthusiasts dissect the details, debating theories and poring over every scrap of information. For some, the case is a puzzle to solve; for others, it's a chilling reminder of the limits of what we can know about those around us. And yet, amidst the speculation, there remains a profound sense of loss. At its heart, this is not just a story about a missing family or the mystery of their vanishing. It is a story about the people who loved them, about the mother who spends sleepless nights imagining what might have happened to her grandchildren, the friend who wonders if they should have asked more questions, the community that struggles to reconcile the familiarity of who they were with the unknowability of what they became. For now, the disappearance of the Caldwells and their housemates is a story without an ending. It hangs in the air, a haunting reminder of the unknown. The hope that they will one day return persists, fragile but unbroken. In the meantime, those left behind are tasked with the difficult work of carrying on, of keeping the memory of the vanished six alive, even as the years pass and the questions remain unanswered. As we reach the end of this journey into the mysterious disappearance of the Caldwell family and their housemates, the lingering questions weigh heavily in the air. 6 lives vanished from a quiet home near St. Louis, leaving behind a story marked by enigmatic clues and unanswered questions. Their journey, whatever it may have been, has left an indelible mark on their community and the hearts of those who search for them still. Throughout this tale, we've unraveled the layers of their lives before the disappearance, their quiet routines, the subtle signs of withdrawal, and the influence of an online cult led by Rashad Jamal. We've followed the timeline of their departure, from their final sighting at the Florissant Hotel to the unsettling discoveries in their abandoned home. And we've explored the theories surrounding their fate, whether they chose to go off the grid in pursuit of enlightenment, fell victim to foul play, or became tangled in the complexities of the ideologies they embraced. Yet, despite the threads we've followed, the full tapestry of their story remains incomplete. Are they living peacefully in anonymity, having achieved the disconnection they sought? Or did darker forces intervene, leading to a fate that remains hidden in the shadows? As we reflect on the possibilities, it's clear that the answers may be as elusive as the vanished 6 themselves. For those left behind, the uncertainty is the hardest part. Margaret's sister, who continues to fight tirelessly for answers, carries the weight of hope and heartache. The neighbors who once shared polite greetings with the family are left grappling with the silence that has taken their place. And the broader community, captivated by the story's twists and turns, is left to wonder how a family so familiar could become so unknowable. But perhaps, as the night settles around us, it's not just the mystery itself that lingers but what it reveals about the human condition. This story is more than a tale of disappearance, it is a reflection of our collective search for meaning. It reminds us of how far we might go to find clarity in a world that often feels overwhelming, and how easily purpose can transform into obsession when left unchecked. So tonight, as you close your eyes, I invite you to reflect. What do you think happened to the vanished 6? Were they seekers of truth who found what they were looking for? Or were they swept up in forces beyond their control? And what does their story teach us about the choices we make, the connections we keep, and the mysteries that remain forever unanswered? Let these questions drift through your thoughts, not as burdens but as quiet musings to accompany you into rest. In the end, even the most perplexing mysteries have the power to remind us of the beauty in reflection, the comfort in wondering, and the serenity in letting go, if only for the night. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.